All right, my name is Grace McKnight, and this is my linguistics research project. It's over the differences between British and American baking and the differences between the terms and the techniques that they use. So, as for previous research done, I couldn't find anything comparing British and American baking. That doesn't necessarily mean there's absolutely nothing out there done research-wise, but as far as when I was looking, I couldn't find anything. And for why I'm doing this, it's really more to just sate my personal curiosity because I really like to bake, and I noticed after baking for several years that British and American baking are pretty much two very different things, and so I just really wanted to see just how different they really are. Now, my literature review, I used three sources: McDermott, Nelson, and Richards. McDermott and Richards were pretty much similar. One used more terms. They covered different terms in their reports. They basically listed terms, gave definitions and examples of how they're used to help American bakers understand the strange terms that British bakers use. And then Nelson also did similarly, but then he also gave a recount of his own personal experience being someone from Britain who moved to the Americas and then attempted to bake and got very confused when British biscuits in America didn't turn out like British biscuits. Now my research questions, how many differences in terms are there between a select number of recipes from a British cookbook versus an American cookbook? And if there are significantly more terms, will there also be more methods or steps used to make the dishes? So basically, if, say, the American or the British cookbook use, on average, more terms than the other, does that mean that they'll use more steps or less steps to create the dishes, which would then possibly create a different dish than the other? So my textual sources, I use two cookbooks: The Great British Bake Off, Big Book of Baking, and The Great American Baking Book. When comparing my recipes, I picked recipes that were similar in how they would be made. So I compared breads with breads and loaves with loaves and cheesecakes with cheesecakes. I would never compare a pie to a cake because they're made differently and they use different steps. So I wouldn't get proper. So this is the table that I used. I chose to use 9 different recipes from each book, which totaled up to be 18 recipes in total from the Great British and then the Great American books. And then I used terms, steps, and then ingredients as well, just to make sure that they were using a similar amount of ingredients to make their breads or the cheesecake, because if you add in a whole lot more ingredients, you're gonna get something new, something different than gingerbread. So my procedure is pretty straightforward. I compared the 18 recipes, 3 of which were cakes, 3 were pies, and then 3 were breads from each book. And I recorded the total number of terms, the steps, and the ingredients used. And then I determined whether the British used more terms when baking than Americans, and if they did they also use more steps to make the dish? So my type of data was quantitative, how many steps, terms, and ingredients. There were limitations to my study because bakers like to make their recipes really unique. It was nearly impossible to find recipes that were exactly the same. Like loaves tend to be different depending on what type of fruit someone put in, or someone else would add like chocolate to a recipe, and another recipe did not have chocolate. So there were some discrepancies, but I wanted to see on an average. Um, and because of my limited budget as a college student, I couldn't afford to buy more than 2 cookbooks, which are surprisingly quite pricey, um, to compare, which limited the size of my study. I really wish I could have bought, like, I don't know, another American and another British cookbook and done like twice as many, but unfortunately, I can't. So, from what I found, on average, the British cookbook used 9 more terms for each recipe than the American cookbook. But even though the British cookbook used more terms, they both used, on average, the same amount of steps and ingredients. The British cookbook, as I found, also went into much greater detail when explaining how to make the dishes compared to the American cookbook. They would um, give more explicit steps, or give better instructions on how to do a specific task, like when removing cakes from the cake tins, to tap on the sides to make sure like you separated the whole cake from the tin. The American cookbook didn't give any warnings or helpful hints on how to do things right. They just set you on your task and away you went. So these are the tables that I used to help kind of make that first table you saw a little easier to understand. So this is just the terms that were used. The British terms are in blue, and then the American terms are in a purplish pink color. So you can really see that most of these, the British used quite a few, at least 5 more terms than the Americans. Um, cheesecake, cheesecake was like, the American cookbook just said like, do this, do this, do this, do this, you're done, the end, which was very different from the British cookbook, which went into excruciating detail on how to get this cheesecake right. It was very interesting comparing. Now, as far as steps went, as you can see, they're very, very close in the steps used, which tells me that like the recipes themselves are very similar. You make them the same way. This is the number of ingredients used, which didn't really change too much from the amount of steps. So again, the dish should turn out to be the same kind of dish, even though the British use significantly more. So basically, I found that my hypothesis was incorrect, because even though the British used way more terms than the American cookbook, there wasn't a difference in methodology or steps between them. And this is my full reference page. Thank you.